Exercise 28, electrical conductivity of the heart. Now before we get into the electric conducting system and other things, let's just look at a few other items right here. First of all, most books will tell you, if you look at the average resting adult, they should have a heart rate of around 72 beats per minute. Be a lot of variation for individuals depending on their health, age, and many other factors, but somewhere between 70 and 75 is always considered an average. 72 is a pretty good number. Next right here we see the term systole and diastole, something you've definitely heard before when you talk about blood pressure, which is a topic we'll get to in the future. Now if you think about why you always get two different pressures when you take the blood pressure in an artery, is because there's always going to be a higher pressure in that artery when the ventricles are contracting, and specifically the left one, since that's what shoves blood into the left brachial artery, which is usually where blood pressure is measured. And there's going to be another pressure, a lower one, whenever that left ventricle is relaxing. So think about this. You always see two different numbers, right? You always see a high one and a low one. High one's always on top, low one's always on bottom. So the top number, systole or systolic pressure, will always be the higher number because that's the pressure in an artery when the left ventricle is contracting. When the left ventricle shoves blood into that artery, pressure is definitely going to be higher. But then that left ventricle relaxes to refill with blood, and the pressure drops a bit. Never down to zero, but of course you usually hope to see something like 120 over 80. So the 120, the top number, is your systolic pressure. That's how much pressure is inside that artery when that left ventricle is pushing blood into it. Then you got that other number, the bottom one, the diastolic. That's going to be the pressure inside that artery when that left ventricle is relaxing to refill. So the pressure goes up, down, up, down. With every contraction and relaxation of that left ventricle, you see these changes in pressure. Now let's mention something here called the electric conducting system of the heart. What this electric conducting system of the heart is a group of specialized cardiac muscle cells. They're more specialized to conduct action potentials, which remember are electric signals generated by cells. And all electric signals going through the heart should always go through these 5 components with a certain timing. You ought to see this going through each one of these units. The electric signals aren't going through these sections one at a time with a particular timing. Heart's going to be out of rhythm. If it's out of rhythm and those chambers and those valves aren't working correctly together in a rhythmic fashion, somebody's not going to be pumping blood the way they should, which of course is never good. So look at these parts of the electric conducting system. Part 1 is called the SA node, also called the pacemaker of the heart. This is located way up high in the right atrium, up close to where that superior vena cava leads into this area. When electric signals leave that SA node, they're going to spread across both atria. Well, that's going to cause both atria to contract. So the electric signal is going to go from the SA node to the AV node. The AV node's down in the inferior part of that right atrium. So the electric signals will spread from part 1 to part 2, causing both atria to contract. That'll generally take about 4/100ths of a second. Once that electric signal leaves the AV node, it's going to travel to the AV bundle, which is right at the very top of the interventricular septum. If you want to call that the bundle of His, same thing right there. Now when that signal goes from part 2 to part 3, it's going to slow down a little bit, taking about 0.11 or so seconds to go from part 2 to part 3. And that electric signal slows down as it goes to part 3 to give the atria time to finish contracting, which is, remember, what happens when the signal goes from part 1 to part 2. So now you've let the atria contract. That's what the first 3 sections right here are all about. You send an action potential through them. Upper chambers called the atria contract. Now remember, the lower ventricles mostly filled when they relaxed, but now these upper atria have put some additional blood in them, and that's good because the more blood the ventricles have in them, the more blood they can move when they go through a contraction. So now we've got to this AV bundle, right at the top of that wall that separates the 2 ventricles. Now that electric signal is going to speed up as it splits and goes to these 2 bundle branches. So these 2 branches go right down the middle of that interventricular septum. And the ventricles and the muscle in it will not be contracting at this time. But then those electric signals hit the very bottom of the heart, that pointy apex as it's called. And from there, the electric signals spread through all the Purkinje fibers from the bottom up. So that's going to cause the ventricles to contract from the bottom up. We'll see a lot more about how that works in other videos. But again, action potential should always follow those 5 items, that particular order with a particular timing. Next right here we have a little mention of an ECG. We're going to have a lot more on this in a little video further along showing the use of one. So an ECG is called an electrocardiogram. Well, just think about that name. Electro, got something to do with electrical. Cardio, heart, and gram, a little picture. What this machine does is measure electric signals generated by cardiac cells when they depolarize and repolarize. In other words, when the muscle in your heart contracts and relaxes, it generates electric signals. And of course, you put these little electrodes on your wrist, ankles, chest, whatever you want, just depends on how many leads you have hooked up. And the machine makes a little picture. Depends on how long the signal takes to get to each one of those wires as to how the picture is made. So you're going to have a little electric picture and printout on a piece of paper that shows you electric signals generated by your heart. Well, if you know what these electric signals represent, they represent actual mechanical events in the heart. So you're going to look at these electric events, think about what they mean mechanically, what's actually happening, what's actually moving and contracting or relaxing in the heart and the cardiac cells, and it tells you a lot about what's going on with the heart. These are very handy tools. You don't have to damage someone to use it, and you can diagnose just about any heart condition if somebody really knows how to read one of these. So looking at an ECG right there, as long as everything's working properly, we're just going to start off here just by looking at what an ECG should look like and why. So ordinarily you're going to see 3 waves on an ECG. The P wave, the QRS complex, and the T wave. Now the first wave, the P wave, will be a little small one. This should always be the first one. Look what this represents. The upper chambers of the heart, the atria, depolarizing. That positive charge being brought into that cell by the movement of positive ion coming internally. Well, when those atria depolarize, that's when the atria contract. Now that first little P wave, the P wave, should take up 4 tiny little squares if you look at a little printout on an ECG. Each one of those squares represents 4 100ths of a second, so 4 squares times 0.04 would be 0.16. 0.16 seconds is how long that P wave should take to occur. If any of these waves are too short or too long, you're not going to be moving blood the way you should. We'll get into that further. But this is what we should see. First, the P wave, 4 squares, 0.16 seconds, that's your atria contracting. Now the second wave is going to be a much taller, much larger wave. Reason being, these are cells depolarizing in the ventricles, and there's far, far more muscle in the ventricles than what there are the atria. So with more muscle cells generating electric signals, you get a much bigger, taller printout for this wave on your little picture. And again, we'll look at some of these in another video coming along. You've probably seen one before. If not, we'll go over it. So the second wave, the QRS wave, shows where the ventricles are depolarizing, which is when the ventricles are contracting. Now there's actually a second wave generated at the same time, but you won't be able to see it. This second wave where the atria repolarize, which is where those upper chambers relax, is a smaller wave than this other one. So this big one just overshadows this second one. But make sure you know both of these things happen at the same time at that QRS complex. And then lastly, you're going to see the T wave. Here's where your ventricles repolarize, which is where the ventricles relax. So look at this right here. We've got our atria contracting and relaxing. We've got our ventricles contracting and relaxing. And as we said, this P wave should take up about 4 squares. 4 times 0.04 be 0.16 seconds. The QRS complex should take up 2 to 2.5 squares. That's about 0.08 to 0.10 seconds. And the T wave should take up about 7 squares, or about 0.28 seconds. And after this T wave, there'll be a little bit of a pause where there'll just be a straight flat line. And then you'll see another P wave. Big, tall QRS and a bit of an elongated T. Another pause, and the whole thing just keeps happening over and over again. This will make more sense to you when we actually look at an ECG, use one, and then look at the little printout that follows. So again, if you look at an ECG paper printout real close, you can see all these real tiny little squares. Again, they represent 0.04 seconds. Electric signals travel very fast, so if you're going to measure the speed of electric signals, it'll have to be done in small units of time. That's why this is so small. So each one of those little squares is 1 millimeter on that little printout of paper. So if each little square goes by every 4/100ths of a second, it's going to be 25 squares passing each second. So those little things are going by really fast. If you look at your average resting adult, and their heart is normal and strong, you should see a cardiac cycle, which is how long it takes for one of these P waves to start, and then for another one to begin after. Should take about 0.7 to 0.8 seconds. So you think about if you got 72 beats in a minute, well, everybody knows there's 60 seconds in a minute. So if 72 happen every 60 seconds, well, they got to be happening faster than 1 a second. So that's exactly what you see. Less than a second on each one. And again, a little bit of variation from person to person, depending on a lot of things. It's just kind of what you see on average. There's also a lot of intervals you can look at on an ECG, and let's just mention just a few of them here, some of the common ones. First one mentioned right here is the PQ interval. Well, that's the timing of that P wave. That's the time from the start of the P to the start of the Q. As we said, that should take about 0.16 seconds right there. If somebody has a PQ interval that takes more than about 0.20, they might have something called heart block. This usually results from a reduced conduction between the atria and the ventricles. We don't get too much into all the problems you can diagnose with one of these. That's a class all to itself. Again, we're mostly looking at what's normal. Now, that may be caused by damage to the AV node, which we mentioned up here, or maybe a decreased transmission to that AV bundle. The QRS complex we mentioned right down here too. As we said, that should take about 0.08 to 0.10 seconds. If it takes more than about 0.12, that's generally caused by a right or left bundle branch block. That's those two branches you see going through the middle of that interventricular septum right here. Can actually cause those two ventricles to just get slightly out of rhythm too. This happens when the ventricles contract at slightly different times, increasing the length of that complex. And then we got this QT interval. Now that's everything from the start of the Q to the end of the T. Again, we said this usually takes about 2.5 squares. This one about 7. So if you had 2 and 7, you got 9. 9 times 0.04 is 0.36. So that's how we got the timing on this one right here. This interval becomes shorter as the heart rate increases. Think about it, if somebody starts to exercise and the heart works faster and faster, this is all going to happen quicker. You're going to see all these little waves get closer together as everything happens quicker. A couple other terms here. Tachycardia is a rapid heart rate. Generally, anything above 100 beats per minute falls into this category here. And then bradycardia, an unusually low or slow heart rate, generally is anything below 60. So there's just a little introduction to our electric conducting system of the heart. We'll look at this a whole lot more in other videos.